video opens in total darkness, the screen pitch black as only the sound of distant, rustling leaves and a faint, chilling breeze fill the silence. Suddenly, a whisper cuts through the void, a low, trembling voice, barely audible, yet laced with an unmistakable sense of dread. Have you ever felt it? That creeping sensation, that something is watching you from the shadows. The screen slowly brightens to reveal the outline of a dense, foreboding forest under a cold, silver moonlight. The camera pans slowly through the twisted trees, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands ready to snatch away anyone who dares to wander too close. As the viewer is drawn deeper into this unsettling scene, the voice returns, now tinged with a hint of desperation. This is not just a story. It's a warning. What you're about to hear is the true account of those who dared to enter the darkness and never came back the same. The camera continues to move through the forest, the sound of snapping twigs and distant, echoing footsteps heightening the tension. Each sound feels closer than the last, as if something or someone is following, always just out of sight. The screen flickers, briefly revealing a shadow darting behind a tree, so quickly that the viewer isn't sure if it was real or just a trick of the light. Once you step into this story, the voice continues, now almost a whisper. You may find that the shadows are closer than you think, and they might be watching you too. The camera halts at the edge of a clearing where a single tent stands eerily still, bathed in the ghostly glow of the moon. The wind picks up, and the fabric of the tent rustles unnervingly, as though something inside is trying to get out. But before we begin, are you sure you're ready? Because once the story starts, there's no going back. A sudden gust of wind blows through the trees, extinguishing the moonlight and plunging the scene back into darkness. The voice, now ominous and cold, delivers the final words before the story begins. Like this video, subscribe to Mind's Labyrinth and share it with those brave enough to join us. For tonight we walk the line between reality and nightmare. The screen flashes white, then fades into the title card, The Shadow in the Forest. As the title slowly fades, the sound of heavy, panicked breathing emerges, signaling that the terror has only just begun. As the story begins, the camera pans across an isolated, ancient forest, where the trees are tall and twisted, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocks out most of the moonlight. The ground is thick with fallen leaves and underbrush, every step crunching underfoot like bones snapping in the silence. A cold mist clings to the earth, swirling in ghostly tendrils around the gnarled roots and creeping along the path that leads deeper into the woods. The air is heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a smell that seems to permeate every breath, filling the lungs with a sense of rot and age. The camera follows a narrow, winding trail that seems to stretch endlessly into the darkness, the trees growing denser and more oppressive with every step. This is no ordinary forest. It feels alive, as though the very woods themselves are watching, waiting. The rustle of leaves overhead is unnervingly constant, like whispers just out of earshot, and the shadows between the trees shift and writhe, as if hiding something that should never be seen. The deeper into the forest the camera moves, the more it feels like the woods are closing in, the path narrowing until it seems there is no way out. Suddenly the scene shifts to a small clearing hidden deep within the forest, a place that feels wrong, as though it shouldn't exist. In the center of the clearing stands an ancient oak, its trunk twisted and blackened as if struck by lightning centuries ago. The tree's roots spread out like the fingers of a giant hand, clawing at the earth as if trying to pull something from the ground below. The air here is colder, the silence oppressive, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the distant echoing call of some unseen creature. At the base of the tree there is a strange, unnatural mound of earth, as though something was hastily buried there. The camera lingers on this spot, the tension mounting as the voiceover whispers, "This place, it holds secrets. Dark, terrible secrets that should have never been disturbed." The mist thickens, swirling more rapidly around the mound, and the shadows seem to lengthen, reaching out toward the camera as if trying to pull the viewer into the darkness. The voice continues, barely above a whisper. They say that those who camp here, those who dare to sleep under the branches of the cursed oak, are never seen again. But their screams can still be heard, echoing through the trees on nights like this. The camera zooms in on the mound, the earth seeming to pulse, as if something beneath is alive, struggling to break free. The atmosphere is thick with dread, every rustle in the leaves and every shift in the shadows adding to the overwhelming sense of being watched, of something waiting just out of sight. The camera pulls back to reveal a dilapidated abandoned tent at the edge of the clearing, half collapsed as if whoever camped there left in a hurry, or was taken. The fabric of the tent flaps eerily in the wind, and the ground around it is disturbed, as if something was dragged away into the forest. The voiceover deepens, filled with a chilling finality. They thought they were alone here, but they were wrong. The forest sees all, and it never forgets. The scene ends with the camera focusing on the dark entrance to the tent, where the faint outline of a handprint can be seen, pressed into the fabric from the inside. The camera slowly fades to black as the sounds of the forest grow louder. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, and the faint, unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching, signaling that whatever haunts these woods is drawing closer. The story unfolds as the group of friends settles into their campsite, their laughter echoing through the forest, a stark contrast to the ominous silence that looms just beyond the circle of their firelight. As the night deepens, the fire crackles and pops, sending fleeting sparks into the air, but the warmth of the flames feels inadequate against the sudden chill that creeps in. The once comforting glow of the fire now casts long, unsettling shadows that dance menacingly on the surrounding trees, giving the illusion that the forest itself is closing in on them. It starts subtly at first, barely noticeable, almost easy to dismiss. One of the friends, let's call him Mark, glances up from the fire, his brow furrowing as he peers into the darkness beyond. "Did you guys hear that?" he asks, his voice tight with unease. The others pause, straining to listen, but only the usual sounds of the night reach their ears. The rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the crackling of the fire. They shrug it off, teasing Mark for being paranoid, but he remains uneasy, his gaze frequently drifting back to the trees, where the shadows seem thicker, darker. As the night wears on, the strange occurrences grow more frequent, more disturbing. The wind begins to whisper through the trees, carrying with it faint, disjointed voices, just on the edge of hearing, impossible to make out, but unmistakably there. The air around the campsite grows heavy, oppressive, as if charged with something unseen but undeniably present. The friends begin to feel it too. A creeping sense of dread, a feeling that they are not alone. They exchange nervous glances, their earlier jovial mood evaporating into a tense silence. Then the shadows start to move. At first, it's just out of the corner of their eyes. A flicker, a shift that they can't quite catch. But soon it becomes impossible to ignore. Dark shapes flit between the trees, quick and silent, always just beyond the reach of the firelight. No matter how fast they turn their heads, the figures are always gone before they can get a clear look, leaving them to wonder if their minds are playing tricks on them, or if something is truly there, watching. It's Lisa, who first mentions the shadow. "I saw something," she whispers, her voice trembling. "Over there, by that tree." She points to a large, twisted oak at the edge of the clearing, its gnarled branches stretching out like claws. The others follow her gaze, their hearts pounding as they peer into the darkness. But they see nothing. Just the inky blackness of the forest, impenetrable and unwelcoming. There's nothing there. One of them mutters, but the reassurance falls flat, the fear in their voices betraying their growing unease. But then, they all see it. A shadow, darker than the night itself, detaches from the trunk of the oak and slips between the trees, moving with an unnatural fluidity. It's too tall, too slender, with limbs that seem to stretch and bend in ways that defy logic. It moves silently, as if it's gliding over the ground, its form indistinct yet deeply, fundamentally wrong. The friends freeze to rouse. their breath catching in their throats as the shadow seems to pause as though it senses their fear, relishing in it. Mark, who has been silent, suddenly stands, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. "We need to leave," he says, his voice barely above a whisper. But before they can react, the shadow moves again, this time closer, its form becoming more defined, more menacing. The fire flickers, the flames shrinking back as if in fear, casting the shadow in sharp, terrifying relief. It's closer now, almost within reach, and as it looms over them, they realize with dawning horror that the shadow is not just an absence of light, but something much worse. Something alive. The camera lingers on the shadow as it hovers at the edge of the firelight, its presence heavy, suffocating. The friends are paralyzed, their minds racing as they try to make sense of the impossible. The night seems to stretch on endlessly, the minutes feeling like hours as the shadow watches, waiting for something they can't comprehend. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the shadow melts back into the darkness, leaving only the echo of its presence lingering in the air. A cold, creeping dread that settles deep into their bones. But the relief is short-lived. The friends know now that they are not alone, and that whatever is out there in the forest has noticed them. And as the night drags on, the feeling of being watched only intensifies, the shadows growing bolder, more sinister, until the line between reality and nightmare begins to blur. Mark, who had been the first to sense something was amiss, is now on edge, his nerves frayed by the constant pressure of the unseen presence that stalks them. He begins to withdraw from the group, his paranoia growing with every passing minute. "Did you see that?" he asks repeatedly, his eyes darting to the trees, to the shadows that seem to move on their own. But each time his friends shake their heads, their patience wearing thin. "It's just your imagination, Mark," Lisa insists, though her voice wavers with doubt. Yet Mark's fear is contagious, spreading through the group like a virus. The tension mounts as the group sits around the dwindling campfire, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The unease is palpable, thickening the air with distrust. Mark's paranoia begins to morph into outright suspicion. "How do we know it's not one of us?" he whispers, his voice trembling with fear and accusation. "How do we know that one of us isn't bringing it here?" His words hang in the air like a curse, a seed of doubt that quickly takes root in the minds of the others. Lisa's face pales, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't be serious," she says, but her voice lacks conviction. The others exchange nervous glances, the unspoken fear settling over them like a shroud. Could it be possible? Could one of them be the reason behind the horrors they're experiencing? The idea is absurd, yet it gnaws at their minds, feeding the growing mistrust. Tom, who had been the most rational among them, begins to crack under the pressure. "Maybe Mark's right," he mutters, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "We don't know what's happening here, or why." His eyes dart to each of his friends in turn, suspicion flickering in his gaze. What if it's feeding off us? Our fear? Our doubts? What if it's trying to turn us against each other? The group falls into a tense silence, the firelight casting eerie shadows on their faces, distorting their features until they seem almost monstrous. The night around them is unnervingly quiet, as if the forest itself is holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable unraveling. The weight of the unknown presses down on them, and with it, the fear that the danger might not be lurking in the forest, but sitting right beside them. Mark's suspicion begins to spiral out of control. Every movement, every word from his friends is now a potential threat in his mind. He watches them with a mix of fear and distrust, his grip tightening on the small hunting knife he's been clutching since the shadow first appeared. "Stay away from me," he warns, backing away from the fire, his eyes wild with fear. "I'm not going to let whatever it is get to me." The group tries to reason with him, but the words feel hollow, their trust in each other shattered by the creeping paranoia. Each of them begins to question not only the reality of the situation, but the motives of those around them. Lisa catches herself staring at the others, wondering if their expressions of fear are genuine or if they're hiding something far more sinister. Tom starts to wonder if the stories they've been told about the forest are true, or if one of his friends is somehow orchestrating these events. The psychological strain is unbearable, the forest around them seeming to close in, amplifying their fear and mistrust. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig sends them into a state of heightened alert. Their nerves frayed, their minds racing. The darkness plays tricks on their senses, warping reality until they can no longer tell what's real and what's a figment of their increasingly paranoid imaginations. As the night drags on, the group's fear transforms into something darker, a festering mistrust that threatens to tear them apart. They sit in silence, each of them isolated by their own thoughts, their own fears, and the growing belief that the real danger might not be the shadow in the forest, but each other. The once strong bonds of friendship have been poisoned by fear, leaving them alone in the dark, surrounded by the unknown and haunted by the suspicion that the true horror lies within their own minds. The forest, once a serene and tranquil place, has now transformed into a labyrinth of fear and uncertainty. The fire, which once provided warmth and comfort, now casts flickering shadows that dance menacingly along the ground, as if taunting the group with the darkness that surrounds them. The sense of foreboding has grown unbearable, a weight pressing down on their chests with every breath. The group's paranoia has reached a fever pitch, and the once unshakable bond of friendship is now frayed and fragile, stretched to its breaking point. It is in this moment of overwhelming dread that Mark, who has been teetering on the edge of sanity, makes a fateful decision. "I can't take it anymore," he mutters, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and resolve. "I have to know what's out there." His words send a chill through the group, a realization that the confrontation they've been avoiding is now inevitable. The shadow that has been haunting them, lurking just beyond the firelight, slipping through the trees, is no longer something they can ignore. It's time to face the unknown. Armed with only a flashlight and the knife he's been clutching all night, Mark steps away from the safety of the campfire. The light from the torch is weak, barely penetrating the thick darkness that surrounds them, but it's all he has. The others watch in stunned silence, their hearts pounding in their chests. They want to stop him, to call him back to the relative safety of the camp, but fear holds them in place, their voices caught in their throats. The camera follows Mark as he steps into the blackness, the trees closing in around him like the bars of a cage. Every footstep seems unnaturally loud, the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot echoing through the silent forest. The flashlight beam cuts through the darkness, illuminating twisted branches and gnarled roots, but the shadow remains elusive, always just out of sight, a flicker at the edge of his vision. The deeper he goes, the more oppressive the atmosphere becomes, the air thick with a sense of malevolence that makes his skin crawl. As Mark ventures further from the campsite, the sounds of the night grow more sinister. The rustling of leaves becomes a low, ominous hiss, and the distant hoot of an owl now sounds like a mournful wail. The flashlight flickers, the battery struggling to hold on, and with each dimming of the light, the shadows seem to grow bolder, creeping closer, as if they're testing his resolve. Mark's breath quickens, his heartbeat pounding in his ears, but he forces himself to keep moving, to confront whatever it is that has been tormenting them. Then, without warning, the flashlight dies, plunging Mark into complete darkness. Panic grips him, his mind racing as he fumbles with the flashlight, desperately trying to coax it back to life. But it's no use. The darkness is absolute, suffocating. The silence around him is deafening, broken only by the sound of his ragged breathing. He's alone, surrounded by the unknown, and for the first time he truly understands the depth of the terror that has been stalking them. But then, something moves. A faint rustle in the darkness, followed by the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and far too close. Mark freezes, his eyes wide with fear as he turns toward the sound, straining to see in the pitch-black void. The footsteps grow louder, closer, until they stop just in front of him. He can feel it. Something is there, standing in the darkness, watching him. The air grows colder, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end as a deep, primal fear takes hold. Suddenly, the darkness seems to shift, a shape forming out of the blackness. It's the shadow, tall, impossibly slender, its limbs elongated and distorted. But now, in the complete absence of light, it's more than just a shadow, it's a living entity, a manifestation of pure, unrelenting fear. It moves with unnatural fluidity, its form warping and bending as it advances on Mark, who is rooted to the spot, paralyzed by terror. Mark's mind races, a cacophony of thoughts and emotions clashing as he tries to process the impossible. This thing, this shadow, is not just a trick of the light or a figment of his imagination. It's real, and it's coming for him. In a desperate act of self-preservation, Mark raises the knife, brandishing it in the darkness, but it feels futile. An empty gesture against something so incomprehensible, so beyond human understanding. The shadow stops, hovering just out of reach, as if taunting him, daring him to make the first move. The tension is unbearable, the air so thick with fear that it's almost suffocating. And then, the shadow strikes. It moves with lightning speed, a blur of darkness that engulfs Mark, overwhelming his senses with a cold, clammy dread that seeps into his very soul. The knife slips from his hand, clattering to the ground as he stumbles backward, his mind reeling. But just as quickly as it appeared, the shadow retreats, melting back into the darkness, leaving Mark gasping for breath, his body trembling with the aftershock of the encounter. He's left alone in the dark, the terror of the moment still fresh in his mind, but with one terrifying realization: the shadow didn't leave because it was defeated. It left because it's not done with them yet. The camera lingers on Mark, his face pale and eyes wide with the horror of what he's just experienced. He turns back toward the campsite where his friends are waiting, oblivious to the nightmare that still looms in the darkness. As he stumbles back to the light of the fire, his footsteps echoing in the silence, he knows that the shadow will return, and when it does, it won't be satisfied with just a confrontation. It will come for them all. The forest is deathly silent as Mark stumbles back to the campsite, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his mind a whirlwind of terror and confusion. His friends rush to his side, their faces etched with fear and concern, but the words stick in his throat, unable to fully convey the horror of what he has just encountered. He doesn't need to speak. The look in his eyes says it all. They know now that whatever is out there in the darkness is far worse than anything they could have imagined. The fire, once a source of comfort, now flickers weakly, the flames struggling to stay alive, as if the very air has been tainted by the malevolent presence that surrounds them. The group huddles closer, their faces illuminated by the dim light, casting eerie, elongated shadows that twist and distort their features, making them almost unrecognizable. The night seems to stretch on endlessly, each minute dragging by with agonizing slowness, the oppressive weight of the unknown pressing down on them, suffocating any remaining hope. It's then that the realization begins to dawn on them. This isn't just a haunting or a malevolent spirit. The shadow is something far more ancient, more primal, a force that defies the very laws of nature. It doesn't belong to this world, and its presence here is an aberration, a tear in the fabric of reality. The realization is horrifying in its implications. They are not just dealing with a ghost or a monster. They are facing something that exists outside the realm of human understanding, something that feeds on their fear, their very essence. Mark, still shaking from his encounter, begins to piece together the fragments of his shattered thoughts. "It's not just following us," he whispers, his voice trembling. "It's inside us." The others look at him in confusion, but the truth of his words hangs heavy in the air. The shadow isn't just an external threat. It's infiltrating their minds, their very souls, warping their perception of reality. It's been toying with them, using their fears, their doubts against them, and now it's preparing to claim them completely. Suddenly the wind picks up, howling through the trees with an almost sentient fury, whipping the fire into a frenzy. The shadows around the campsite begin to shift and writhe, growing darker, more solid, as if they're being drawn to the fear that now permeates the group. The ground beneath them seems to pulse, the very earth itself rejecting their presence, and the air grows thick with a choking sense of dread. The group realizes with a sickening certainty that the shadow is no longer content to remain hidden. It's coming for them, and this time it won't stop until it has consumed them all. The camera zooms in on Lisa, whose face is pale and eyes wide with terror, as she suddenly gasps, clutching her head, as if trying to fend off some invisible force. "It's in my mind," she cries out, her voice filled with a raw, primal fear. I can't think. I can't." Her words dissolve into incoherent mutterings, and she collapses to the ground, writhing in agony as the shadow invades her thoughts, twisting her memories, her sense of self, until she's left a hollow shell of who she once was. The others watch in horror, powerless to help, their own minds beginning to fracture under the strain. Tom staggers backward, his hands clawing at his head, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps as he too begins to lose his grip on reality. The shadow is relentless, invading their minds with a cold, calculating cruelty, stripping away their sanity piece by piece until they're left with nothing but the raw, animalistic fear that has been driving them from the start. And then, in a moment of horrifying clarity, Mark realizes the truth. The shadow isn't just feeding on their fear, it's a part of them. It's been there from the beginning, lurking in the darkest corners of their minds, growing stronger with every doubt, every fear, every moment of despair. It's not just some external force. It's the manifestation of everything they've been trying to suppress, every fear they've refused to face, every dark thought they've buried deep within themselves. And now, it's taken form, a physical embodiment of the terror they've been carrying all along. The revelation is like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of Mark as the realization hits him with full force. There's no escaping the shadow because it's not just out there in the forest. It's inside them, a part of them that they can never truly outrun. The only way to survive is to confront it head-on, to face the darkness within themselves and somehow find the strength to resist it. But as the shadow looms closer, its form shifting and warping with a nightmarish fluidity, Mark knows that this is easier said than done. The shadow is relentless, merciless, feeding on their fear, their despair, until there's nothing left but darkness. The fire sputters and dies, plunging the campsite into pitch-black darkness as the shadow closes in, its presence suffocating, inescapable. In the final heart-pounding moments, Mark and his friends are forced to confront the ultimate horror. Not the shadow itself, but the darkness within their own minds. It's a battle they're woefully unprepared for, a fight for their very souls against an enemy that knows their every fear, their every weakness. The tension is unbearable, the air thick with the terror of what's to come, as the shadow finally reveals its true form, a grotesque amalgamation of their deepest, darkest fears, a twisted reflection of the monsters they've tried to hide from the world and from themselves. As the screen fades to black, the last thing the viewer hears is the sound of heavy, panicked breathing, followed by a chilling, otherworldly whisper. You can't escape the darkness, because the darkness is you. The darkness is absolute. The shadow has consumed the light, leaving the group in a void of fear and uncertainty. The once vibrant campfire is nothing more than a smoldering heap of ash, the embers flickering weakly in the cold, oppressive night. The air is thick with the scent of burnt wood and something else. Something foul and decayed, like the stench of death lingering just out of sight. The group huddles together, their faces pale and drawn, each of them grappling with the horror of what they've just endured. The confrontation with the shadow has left them shaken, their minds fractured by the revelations they've faced. Mark, his breathing ragged and uneven, glances around at his friends. They are no longer the people he knew. Fear has transformed them into shadows of their former selves, their eyes hollow, their expressions haunted. The realization that the shadow was not just an external force, but a manifestation of their own inner demons has left them reeling, and the knowledge that the darkness still lingers within them is almost too much to bear. The forest, once merely a backdrop to their terror, now feels like a living entity, its twisted branches and gnarled roots closing in around them as if the woods themselves are aware of the darkness that has been unleashed. As the minutes stretch into an agonizing eternity, the group begins to stir, the paralysis of fear slowly giving way to a desperate need for action. "We have to get out of here," Lisa whispers, her voice trembling with barely contained panic. The others nod in agreement, their faces etched with exhaustion and dread. But as they gather their belongings, the reality of their situation begins to sink in. The forest is vast and unyielding, the path back to civilization a twisted maze that seems to shift and change with every step. The shadow is gone, but its presence still lingers in the air, a cold, suffocating weight that presses down on them, filling their minds with doubt and fear. As they begin their journey back through the forest, the sense of dread only intensifies. The trees seem to close in around them, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, scratching at their skin as they pass. The path, once familiar, now feels alien and treacherous. Every step fraught with the fear that the shadow might return at any moment. The wind whispers through the trees, carrying with it the faint, haunting echoes of the voices they heard earlier. Disjointed and distant, but unmistakably real. It's as if the forest itself is alive, watching their every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. As they press on, the group's pace quickens, their footsteps crunching through the underbrush with a frantic urgency. But no matter how fast they move, the forest seems to stretch endlessly before them, the path winding on and on with no end in sight. The fear that they will never escape begins to take hold, gnawing at their resolve, sapping their strength. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sends them into a state of heightened alert, their nerves frayed, their minds teetering on the edge of madness. Suddenly, Tom stops in his tracks, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. "Wait," he whispers, his voice barely audible. "Did you hear that?" The others freeze, straining to listen, but the only sound is the howling wind and the rustling of leaves. "It's nothing," Lisa insists, but her voice is tinged with doubt. The group exchanges nervous glances, their fear and paranoia growing with each passing moment. They know now that the forest is not just a place, it's a trap, a living nightmare designed to ensnare them, to keep them lost and afraid until the shadow can claim them for good. But they can't stop. They know that if they give in to their fear, if they allow the darkness to take hold, they will never make it out. And so they press on, each step a battle against the growing sense of dread, each breath a struggle to maintain their grip on reality. The path twists and turns, leading them deeper into the forest, further from the safety they so desperately seek. The shadows grow darker, more oppressive, and with every step, the feeling that they are being watched intensifies. As they round a bend in the path, they see it, a faint glimmer of light through the trees, the first sign of hope they've had since the nightmare began. The sight fills them with a renewed sense of determination, and they quicken their pace, the thought of escape driving them forward. But as they draw closer, the light begins to flicker, fading in and out like a dying flame. And then, just as they reach the edge of the clearing, the light vanishes, leaving them in complete darkness once more. Panic sets in, and the group begins to splinter, their fear driving them in different directions. Mark grabs Lisa's arm, pulling her back toward the path. "We have to stick together," he insists, his voice filled with urgency. But the others are already scattering, their terror pushing them into the unknown. The camera follows Mark and Lisa as they push through the underbrush, the sound of their ragged breathing filling the air. The darkness is suffocating, and the sense of dread is overwhelming, but they force themselves to keep moving, driven by the desperate hope that they can still find a way out. But as they push deeper into the forest, it becomes clear that the path has changed. The trees are closer together, their branches twisted and tangled, forming a nearly impenetrable barrier. The ground beneath their feet is soft and uneven, the roots of the trees seeming to pulse with a life of their own. And the air is thick with the smell of decay, as if something ancient and foul lies just beneath the surface. Finally, they reach a small clearing, but it offers no relief, only more terror. In the center of the clearing is a large, twisted tree, its bark blackened and cracked as if burned by fire. The ground around it is littered with bones, half buried in the earth, their surfaces worn smooth by time. And there, at the base of the tree, is the source of the light they saw earlier, a single flickering candle, its flame weak and guttering. As they approach the tree, a sense of dread washes over them, and they realize with a sickening certainty that this is where it all began. The shadow, the fear, the darkness, it all emanates from this place. The tree is ancient, older than the forest itself, and it holds within it a malevolent force that has been waiting, watching, feeding on the fear of those who wander too close. Mark and Lisa exchange a look of despair, knowing that they are trapped, that there is no escape from the terror that has ensnared them. But as they stand there, staring at the tree, something changes. The ground beneath their feet begins to shift, the earth trembling as if alive. The shadows around them grow darker, thicker, closing in on all sides. And then, from the darkness, a figure emerges, a twisted, grotesque form, its limbs elongated and distorted, its face a mask of pure malevolence. The shadow has returned, and it's more powerful than ever. It looms over them, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. And as it advances, Mark and Lisa realize with a final horrifying clarity that the nightmare will never end. The shadow is not just a part of the forest. It is the forest, a living, breathing entity that feeds on fear and despair. There is no escape, no way out. The darkness has claimed them, and it will never let them go. The screen fades to black as the camera pulls back, the final shot lingering on the twisted tree and the flickering candle, the only light in an endless sea of darkness. The sound of the wind rises, carrying with it the faint, haunting echoes of the voices they heard earlier, voices that will continue to haunt the forest, a warning to all who dare to enter. The last thing the viewer hears is the whisper of the wind, cold and unrelenting. You can't escape the darkness, because it's a part of you now. The first light of dawn breaks through the tangled canopy of the forest, casting long, pale beams that barely penetrate the heavy mist clinging to the ground. The once impenetrable darkness has given way to a gray, muted light, but it offers no comfort, only the cold, hollow reminder of the nightmare that has transpired. The forest, which had seemed so alive with malevolent intent just hours before, now appears eerily still, as if it too is recovering from the horrors of the night. Mark and Lisa, the last two survivors of the ordeal, stumble out of the forest, their clothes torn, their faces gaunt and pale, eyes wide with the trauma of what they've endured. They move like ghosts, their steps slow and unsteady, as if the weight of the night still clings to them, dragging them down. The road before them is empty, stretching out into a foggy void, but they know it leads back to the world they once knew, a world that now seems distant and unreal. They collapse at the edge of the road, too exhausted to continue, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The silence around them is oppressive, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze, a stark contrast to the cacophony of terror that had filled the night. But even as they sit in the quiet morning light, the shadow of what they've experienced lingers, a darkness that refuses to lift, no matter how bright the day becomes. Mark stares down at his hands, trembling as if they no longer belong to him. His mind races with fragmented memories, visions of the shadow, the twisted tree, the faces of his friends distorted by fear. He can still feel it, that creeping sense of dread, like something lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. He knows that the forest is behind them, that they've escaped its clutches, but the shadow has followed them. It's inside him now, a part of him that he can never truly escape. Lisa's voice breaks the silence, a mere whisper carried on the wind. It's not over, is it? Her words hang in the air, a terrible truth that neither of them wants to acknowledge, but both know is undeniable. The terror they faced in the forest was not just a physical entity, but a manifestation of something much deeper, something rooted in their own minds, their own fears. And now that they've faced it, they can never go back to the way things were. The darkness has marked them, and it will haunt them for the rest of their lives.